The U.S., the Biden administration have announced plans to send an additional $2.2 billion in aid to Ukraine. This will include Javelin anti-tank missiles, artillery ammunition, and conventional and long-range rockets for HIMARS. And this comes as the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian leadership is demanding ATACMS missiles, which can reach cities in the interior of Russia, as well as F-16 jets after receiving authorization of a shipment of Abrams tanks and German Leopard tanks under U.S. pressure. So this brings, according to Jack Detch, the total of U.S. military aid to Ukraine to $29.3 billion since Russia's full-scale invasion. I think the number is much higher. I've seen the number of aid in total, including humanitarian aid and, the aid used to allow the Ukrainian parliament to increase their salaries, putting it at close to $100 billion.
Oh, well, yeah, the amount approved, authorized is definitely over $100 billion. That's official. In terms of what's been dispersed, I'm sure it's also more than that 29 billion there, but yeah, this is just another escalation, and it comes after the U.S. approved sending M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, and there's talk now of sending F-16s, and there's also talk, and we can play some of these clips in the British media of, high-ranking former officials who want to send troops. They actually want to fight Russia directly, which is a recognition, I think, that this war is not going as advertised. We've been told that Ukraine is routing Russia, expelling Russia from its territory. Doesn't seem to be the case, because the way these people are talking, they sound pretty panicked. So
are you suggesting boots on the ground?
I think that is something that we now have to consider, Kay. Yes, I do. I feel that certainly if you were to put a NATO force in there, that would be NATO versus Russia. But Russia is the guilty party here. Russia has invaded
Defense Minister
another
of the UK.
Sovereign state. And we have declared, everybody in the West has declared that Ukraine has got to win, and we're doing a tremendous amount. Britain led the way under Boris Johnson in leading the support for Ukraine. But I do think we have to think very hard where this is going, because at the moment what it's looking like is a stalemate with Russia just flattening whole parts of that sovereign country, like they did in Aleppo. They are a brutal regime. They lie through their teeth. And the West has got to decide that if it is going to support Ukraine, and Ukraine does have to win, because if Ukraine does not win, where will Putin go next?
So that was the former defense minister of the UK basically saying we need to consider boots on the ground. They're talking about it. They're paving the path. And as we've clearly established through internal classified British Ministry of Defense documents and correspondences between advisors to the MOD in the UK through the reporting of Kit Clarenberg, they are attempting to push the US further than it wants to go and consider Biden to be kind of a mollycoddler because he doesn't want to escalate to that degree. That's been the real role of the UK. Aaron, you're muted.
What does a mollycoddler mean?
It's like an old-timey term. I think it might have. Some people in the chat are going to correct me. I think it's a World War I era term. It's for people who coddle foreign enemies.
Got it.
Or overprotective of designated enemies. Yeah. I actually had, I learned that term because it came back during the Iraq War, the second Gulf War, as part of the lexicon of Bush Republicans to attack people like David Corn, who I thought were against the Iraq War, but turned out to have just been against Bush's Republican War. We got more. I mean, this is Tobias Ellwood. And for those of you who don't know, Tobias Ellwood is a member of Britain's 77th Brigade, which is the propaganda wing of the British military. They run troll farms on Twitter. They are specifically engaged in trying to drum up support among the British public for a war with Russia. And here's one of the most hysterically anti-Russia figures in the UK, who happens to be the head of the Defense Committee in the British Parliament, which puts him in a pretty influential position.
We are now at war in Europe. We need to move to a war footing. We are involved in that. We've mobilized our procurement processes. We're gifting equipment. We need to face Russia directly and rather than leaving Ukraine to do all the work. We are now at war in Europe. We need to move to a war footing. We are involved in that.
Okay, so I mean, very similar to the remarks by German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who said we are at war with Russia.
That's right.
This is sort of a unilateral declaration without the German public participating in a vote on whether their country should go to war with Russia. Here you have another influential figure, this time in the UK, saying the same thing.
Yeah. And then we have David Petraeus, the former head of the CIA, who is still somehow talking about the prospect of regime change in Russia, as if that is somehow not only desirable, but attainable at a time when Putin still has huge support from the Russian population. Here's Petraeus speaking to David Ignatius of the Washington Post.
The other alternative, of course, is regime change. And that is so hard to calculate. And he has such a grip on power. This is not just an autocracy, as you know, it's a dictatorship. And within that, it's a kleptocracy dictatorship. And everyone around him is in a position because the individual is intensely loyal and proven himself to Putin. Very, very hard in that kind of scenario. Lots of different security services, all of which, again, Putin controls, to try to plan and carry out some kind of coup. But also, as you know from history, what is inconceivable all of a sudden can become inevitable, sometimes overnight. And looking for those kind of indicators is something that an organization near and dear to both our hearts looking for, I'm sure, very, very assiduous.
So
keep hope alive, everybody. Keep hope alive. Regime change.
Well,
sure. Putin has a lot of support, but keep hope alive. Maybe it can happen very quickly.
Well, that isn't that the point of the war? It is a regime change war.
Absolutely.
And that's the whole point of the project of Ukraine, is the anti-Russia. That's the whole point of the U.S. trainers in Ukraine. That's the point of the U.S. weapons. That was the point of the Maidan coup.
Of the sanctions now aimed at destroying the Russian economy, which has not worked. GDP has shrunk a little bit, but the collapse of the ruble, like Biden said, we're going to turn the ruble into rubble. That just hasn't happened.
To turn the ruble into rubble, the whole point would be to set the Russian population against the Kremlin and create some basis for a color revolution, mass discontent. I think that's highly unlikely, but this, as the Kremlin and Russian leadership openly acknowledges, this war is an existential war. This is a war. This is a to be or not to be situation. There are plans to balkanize Russia, to break it up into 5, to weaken Russia, to bring it back to the 90s when it was kind of a Mad Max style capitalist free market dystopia. This war, if Russia loses and is forced to pull back, if it cedes Crimea, this could lead towards a regime change style scenario. And that is the objective of people like David Petraeus. And I think that's what he has in mind. That's the point of what was once considered unthinkable, to send the tanks, then to send the F-16s, then to send the ATACMS, then to send the boots on the ground, to send the troops. And what I'm worried about, because they are so hell-bent on regime change, because of what Putin represents in terms of a fulcrum point to a multipolar world order and, reversing the unipolar trend, is some kind of incident that would be like Duma on a grand scale, Aaron, that would trigger a NATO Article 5. Do you share that?
I think that's totally fair to speculate. Remember, there was talk of that early in the war. Remember, we were hearing speculation and warnings from the U.S. that Putin was going to use chemical weapons in Ukraine.
Yeah.
There even was an incident where some people, I think tied to the Azov battalion, tried to claim that they were victims of a chemical attack. So, of course, I think that's definitely in the playbook. And I'm sure there are people inside the national security state who are considering something like that. I think it's totally fair to speculate because we have a record of it, as we saw in Syria. And by the way, after our stream ends, we're going to publish my newest article on the OPCW cover scandal, where we're going to have a lot more on that. And we're exposing basically the OPCW's brand new deception on that. And it's quite the story.
Yeah. Well, I just read it. We've been preparing it. It's a devastating piece. And it's all we can do as journalists. And we can't cover all of these deceptions and incidents. I mean, I'm sort of shocked that the fighting around the Zaporozhye nuclear plant in Ukraine didn't amount to something more catastrophic, because you had Russian troops controlling the area around the Zaporozhye nuclear plant, and Ukrainian forces attacking it, shelling a nuclear plant day after day after day. And then you'd see one headline after another in US media, Zaporozhye plant shelled, but they never say who's doing it. And they make you think that Russia is attacking a nuclear plant to cause mass death and another Chernobyl across Ukraine.
A plant that they control.
They're setting a tripwire.
A plant that they control. The idea we're supposed to believe is that just as Russia supposedly blew up its own pipeline, the Nord Stream 2, we also were supposed to believe that Russia was shelling a nuclear plant that its own forces were controlling.
Question here about a new documentary about Mariupol. I haven't seen it, but I'll be checking it out.
I know that documentary was featured on Democracy Now! Last week or something. So it's a safe bet that it's proxy war propaganda. I think that's a very safe bet. But we do have another clip, and this is of another former national security state official with a different take than what we've been hearing, who actually acknowledges, I think, the reality, who's saying that this war is not going as advertised. And it's Richard Kemp, who is a retired British Army commander.
Yeah, this is Colonel Richard Kemp. He, I think he was active in the destruction of Yugoslavia, maybe in the first Gulf War as well. And then he basically got a gig as a asset of the Israel lobby and was sent around the world to sing Israel's praises. But here he is making unusually candid comments.
The first thing I'd say is not to take too much notice of what most of the mainstream media has got to say about Ukraine, because most of them, and are really just regurgitating the Ukrainian general staffs. They're not taking account of other perspectives, such as what the Russians are saying they're doing. And very often that does lead to a distorted picture. But I think in reality, the Russians are doing their best now, as we speak, to take the whole of the Donbass region in eastern Crimea, eastern Ukraine. And they're being quite successful at that. I think they're hammering the hell, unfortunately, out of the Ukrainians with artillery and then going in to mop them up. It's a slow, long process. But I think eventually, unfortunately, they will probably prevail in eastern Ukraine.
And that seems to be recognized as well by David Ignatius to some extent in a recent column at the Washington Post. If you don't know who David Ignatius is, he's basically the CIA and the State Department's favorite stenographer in Washington, or one of them. He obviously was just speaking on behalf of Tony Blinken, who he'd interviewed, and they were talking about how there was going to have to be some settlement. I don't know if they were thinking it would be along the lines of the Dnieper River, but they're taking Crimea off the table there. And here you have a recognition by a figure who is not Chomskyan interventionist critic in mainstream British media, that Russia will eventually take the Donbass region.
Yeah, because it's obvious. We've gotten so much propaganda, but this could only go on for so long. And this was always going to be the case, where Russia just has dominant military power. There are elements of the U.S. that don't want to fight Russia directly, especially in the Pentagon, who know what that would entail. And so the U.S. plan has always been to prolong this for as long as possible without triggering direct confrontation. So basically use Ukraine to bleed Russia as much as they could. And now we're seeing the results, and it's impossible to hide that anymore. And I'm sure, if I'm a betting person, I think that they're going to try as long as they can to keep this going for as long as they can. Yeah. But there's a recognition that it has to end eventually, because the only way it ends with Russia losing is if there's nuclear war, and then we all lose. So hopefully there are people who will constrain the forces that are willing to risk that, because there are some people inside the government that are willing to risk that outcome.
Where I see it going, where I think a lot of smart people I listen to see it going, which could be wrong, is a Russian counteroffensive by the spring, Russia gaining ground, and more desperation or more calls for boots on the ground, direct intervention. And I can't say where it would go from there, but I think that increases the likelihood of a Duma-like incident triggered to save what's left of the Ukrainian military as it falters. And, I hope I don't have to go back to this live stream and clip out what I just said when that takes place. But given the history that we've learned in Syria, Libya, and, even before that, the whole history laid out in Bosnia, which we now understand better through Canadian peacekeeper cables that were reported on by Kit Clarenberg and Tom Secker that you can read at the Grayzone. These kind of false flag incidents have been central to driving Western intervention in these kinds of conflicts. And so that's something that we should all be incredibly concerned about as we hear those calls for direct intervention intensifying